Welcome to Grace for All with Jamie Englehart.
Welcome to Grace for All. I am your host, Jamie Englehart, and we're so blessed to have you stop by and view our program. And we thank you for all of our sponsors, all of our viewers, all of our friends, all of our partners that believe in the grace that's on our life and for receiving this beautiful message, this beautiful gospel that we carry. Well, we have been in a series now for this whole first year, which will be from May of 24, at least probably till May of 25. We'll see. It might go further. It might be a little less. We'll kind of see. I'm just kind of weighing that out as we continue to produce these programs. But called Foundations, and looking at, first of all, how to properly see God, and then how to properly view ourselves, and how to live this life and see God from the proper perspective, because how we view God has everything to do with how we see ourselves, and then ultimately how we see other people. And in the midst of that, we have been for the last 3 programs on a mini-series in the midst of Foundations called Grace Giving. And what does it look like in the new covenant? Because we're not Jews living under the Old Testament or the Old Covenant. We're not obliged to pay temple taxes. We're not obliged to pay the tithes, plural, that Malachi 3 talks about. Not tithe, individual, but tithes, plural, which were 4 or 5, upwards of 6 in the Old Testament, and they were their taxation system. But in this new covenant, it's all about not the what we do, but the why. We're going to get into that maybe the next program or the one after that. That God is far more concerned in this new covenant. It's why Jesus on the Sermon on the Mount, he would say, you've heard said, you've heard said an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say, love your enemies, bless those that despitefully use you. Don't render evil for evil. Jesus, all through the Sermon on the Mount, began to deal with, he's like, it's one thing for you to go out and commit adultery. But if you even lusted in your heart after a woman, he said, then you've already done it in your heart. He said, I'm not just dealing with the what you do, but the why you do what you do. Because grace is so much more about the motivation of the why. We're not giving because God is some spiritual slot machine in the sky and we put so much money in and then we get so much back. We're not giving because we went to a TV preacher's conference and he said, if you'll give $50.81 according to Psalm 50, whatever, that God's going to pay off all your debts at the end of the year. That's called magic. That is a whole bunch of other stuff that I don't even want to deal with and get into, because I detest manipulation. I detest it in any form whatsoever. I refuse to do it. I won't do it. I won't beg. I won't. I have a hard time many times even asking for myself. That's why as I travel around the country on Sunday mornings, most Sunday mornings, I will show a video or at least share a little bit about Compassion International, which is one of the things that's very dear to our heart. And I'm going to talk about that here over the next 2 sessions also. One of the largest organizations in the world that helps feed and clothe and educate children of third world countries. An amazing, amazing ministry. And I have no problem. I'll squeeze a nickel out of an American to get him to help a child in a third world country that's impoverished. But man, sometimes asking for something from me is at times very difficult. It's not in me to want to manipulate for finances at all. I absolutely detest it on every and any level. But as we get into this motivation of the why, what I want to talk about in this session is the difference between a harvest and inheritance. Now, first of all, understand something. Even in the new covenant, there is seed time and harvest. Genesis tells us that seed time and harvest shall remain as long as the earth remains. So this earth isn't going anywhere, and seed time and harvest isn't. Whatever you sow, that you shall reap. If you sow a seed into the ground, you get according to what you sow back. You don't get something else. you get what you put in. If you sow corn, you get corn. If you sow peanuts, you get more peanuts back. If you sow an apple tree, you get an orchard of apples. Whatever you sow, you reap. If you sow to the flesh, Paul said, in Galatians, you reap of the flesh. If you sow to the Spirit, you reap of the Spirit. It doesn't matter what covenant you are under, sowing and reaping is a principle. It's no different than the law of gravity. What goes up must come down. All right, and so God has placed so many of these principles and laws in the earth that have nothing to do with being under the law of Moses. They're just literally like the laws of nature, the laws of the land. And sowing and reaping is a big part of that. And it's so important for us to realize that I think what happens sometimes is this, is many of us perhaps have come from ministries that did manipulate people. They use the tithe as something to beat people over the head. I mean, I still remember a day where, man, I mean, I was taught this so strong that I was taught the teruma, I was taught all the tithes. And so the $25 out of every 1,000 I would send to who was my bishop or apostle or my pastor directly. Then I would give 10% to that which was feeding me. For me, it wasn't a local church. It was a network of churches because that's what was feeding me and what I was a part of. But then on top of that, we also then gave offerings. Matter of fact, for years, my wife and I, we've always made sure that we give to ministries that are caring for and taking care of the poor, because Proverbs tells us, and Psalms, that when you give to the poor, you will never lack. Another one says, if you give to the poor, you lend to God. And so literally in our lives, my wife and I, we just celebrated our 33rd year of marriage, now going into our 34th year of marriage. 34th, Lord, I'm wrong there, 34th going into our 35th year of marriage. And we have never lacked. We've never not been able to pay our bills. God has taken care of us and sustained us. And of course, we've had to be faithful stewards in the midst of that and be wise with our money and budget and everything else. But we've literally never lacked. I mean, you got to understand something. Our first year traveling and preaching, we made $11,260 some for the year. Our budget was, if we hit $1,000 a month, we were shouting. I remember the first time we got a $1,000 offering in a 1-week revival. I mean, we got a whole month in 1 week. I thought we'd died and gone to heaven. I mean, I don't even know how we paid our bills back then. We were living, we were traveling, gas, we had a car payment, we had school bills on top of it. Just all the expenses. And of course, we were getting reimbursed for a lot of our travel expenses, but there's times we would go into churches and we would preach a whole week and the pastor would tell us, hey, the person that writes the checks wasn't here, the check's in the mail, and the check never come. And it's like, well, God bless you, pastor, we appreciate that. Or there was times that we would go preach for a whole week in a place, and by the time we figured our expenses and they gave us the offering, we paid them $100 just to come preach for them. And so I look back at how God sustained us and took care of us, because every year we began to increase our giving. And as we increased our giving and the more faithful we were, then we began to see increase in our lives, because whatever you sow, that shall you reap. And it's very important to understand responsibility and stewardship, because those are kingdom principles. And regardless of what covenant you are under. So this is not obligatory laws that we try to keep. And if I do this, then God will do this. The truth is, God's already done everything He's going to do. He's blessed us. He loves us. His love and care for us doesn't change regardless of what we do with our money. But our responsibility with what we do with our money has a lot to do with increase that we receive. We're blessed to be a blessing. And so every year, my wife and I, we would increase our giving to the poor, and we never lacked. And it says that you lend to God. Literally, God will be in debt to you. Because this is one thing I found, and the thing I really want to drive home in this session, is that all through Scripture, when increase and blessings came, it didn't have to do with people just following a principle. It had to do with people listening to God's voice. See, I don't believe that God is obligated to do stuff for us that He never told us to do. If we just decide we're going to go do something and God had nothing to do with it at all, and then we wonder, Well, God, how come this didn't happen? How come this didn't happen? We heard a preacher say, if you give $1,000, God's going to give you $100,000. He's going to give you a 100-fold return. And we went and did it, and God wasn't telling us to do it. It was something that we just decided to do. I don't believe God has to back that up. Now, will there be a harvest from that $1,000 somewhere? Yeah, because whatever you sow, you reap. But $100,000 or, if the way a lot of preachers have taught 100-fold returns, if it's 100% return, man, a lot of us would be multimillionaires by now. Do you realize that the word 100-fold actually in its original form and intent gives more of a picture of fullness? Because your 100-fold may be different than mine. You may need $20 million to fulfill your purpose. I may only need $200,000 to fulfill my purpose. But it's all about fullness. It's not about percentages, because then we can get really caught up in that stuff. But the key to all of this, listening to God's voice. And so what I want to talk about is the difference between harvest and inheritance. Because see, a harvest you work for, an inheritance you wait for. That's the beauty of entering in this new covenant rest. And so let me start by reading to you Genesis 22. I'm going to start in verse 14. This, of course, is the story of Abraham willing to offer up Isaac, and God saying, no, I don't want you to offer your own son. I'm not like all the pagan gods that demand those sacrifices. I require obedience over sacrifice. But then he goes on to tell him, because you've not withheld your son from me. Verse 14 of Genesis 22. And Abraham called the name of the place, the Lord will provide, or Jehovah Jireh. For as it is said to this day, in the mountain of the Lord it shall be provided. Then the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time out of heaven and said, by myself I have sworn, says the Lord, because you have done this thing and you've not withheld your son, your only son. In other words, you gave your absolute best, the thing most precious to your heart. In blessing, I will bless you. Now, did you catch that? In blessing, I will bless you. In other words, when you get busy being a blessing, which is what Abraham did and was, I will then bless you even more. In multiplying, I will multiply your descendants. He said, so now I'm not just dealing with a harvest, I'm dealing with an inheritance, because now this isn't just what you get, it's about what your children and children's children get to walk in. I will multiply your descendants as the stars of the heaven, as the sand which is on the seashore, and your descendants, your seed, shall possess the gate of their enemies. In your seed, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. Isn't it interesting? It all came because he obeyed the voice of God. It was in that simple obedience, really, Abraham learned to be a steward. God, everything I have is yours, including my family, including my children. If you want my child is yours, because I'm going to trust, as the writer of Hebrews said, I'm going to trust that if this is the promise, that you're going to then raise him from the dead. And I love that it said that your seed will possess the gate of their enemies, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed by your seed. Not seeds, but your seed, which of course there was a beautiful fulfillment and picture there that Christ is called the seed, not seeds of Abraham. There's a natural picture and a spiritual picture. So let's look at the difference between harvest and inheritance. See, we live in a culture that is motivated by harvest and blessing, not inheritance and birthright. But the kingdom is multi-generational. The kingdom is not just things that we do for ourselves, but also what we do affects our children and our children's children. Did you know that in Deuteronomy, when God gives through Moses, when he gives him the law, and he says, when you do what I say and you keep this law and you keep all these commands, he said that not only will I bless you, but I'm going to also bless your seed. In other words, the decisions that we make doesn't just affect us, it also affects our children and our children's children. So when we're lazy stewards, as I shared in the last program, when we're individuals that are not being faithful with our finances, it doesn't just affect us, it also affects our children's children. Proverbs says that a good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children, not just to his children. The truth is, our children really don't need an inheritance from us. Because if we live till 70, 80 years old, our kids are already in their 50s and 60s. And I mean, let's be honest, they've probably already got their house paid off. They're financially already doing well. But it's our grandkids that are right in that stage of maybe buying their first house, or they're having their first child. And they're the ones that are going to really need it at that moment. But it's so important to understand, because we live in a culture that is gimme, 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 gimme. I want to get mine, get yours while you can get yours. It's not multi-generational in its thinking. And we don't think about birthright. The birthright is what the firstborn son was given, and he would divvy out then the wealth to the rest of the family. So you wanted to make sure that you kept a good relationship with your elder brother, because your inheritance and what you would get after your parents passed had a lot to do with your relationship with your big brother. Now, the good thing is Jesus is our elder brother, and our relationship with him is a beautiful thing because it's based on his faithfulness and not ours. And he loves to bless his family. Now let's look at a few of these differences. Harvest versus inheritance. Harvest is a blessing. It's something you work for or something you do. I do my part. I sow the seed. I get something in return. Inheritance is something you wait for and position yourself for. And only sons and daughters get an inheritance. You don't get an inheritance if you're not a son and daughter. If you still think like an orphan, act like an orphan, if you have, as I shared with you back here in some of the sessions back here about, I think 6 to 8 sessions or so ago, we talked about what it meant actually to have that orphan thinking compared to son thinking. If you don't know who you are and you don't know your identity, you don't know that you're a beloved son and daughter, all of that also affects how you think about money and giving. Pagans can get a harvest using the law of seed time and harvest, but you only get an inheritance by birth and relationship. An orphan can't get an inheritance because they are not positioned for one, or they don't know who they are. Now, this is the beautiful thing in the new covenant. In the new covenant, Paul tells us in Ephesians 1 that we might know what is the glory of the riches of his inheritance in the saints. He's placed an inheritance already in us. And our waiting is simply learning how to rest. We don't labor for it. We don't strive for it. We just receive it simply by faith. And the beautiful thing is it's even his faith. He's like, man, I'm not holding out on you at all. I not only want to bless you with a harvest, I also want to give you an inheritance because you're my sons and daughters. But in the natural, experientially, subjectively by faith, if we don't know who we are, there's this wonderful inheritance that wants to overflow out of us. But if we don't know who we are, we don't know how to tap into it, we don't know how to receive it, and we don't know how to then experience it. Harvest is when you put seed in the ground and you get a blessing. Inheritance is when you get the ground the seed is put in. So you have a perpetual harvest and a generational blessing. You see, it's one thing to be the person that says, okay, I want to rent 30 acres from a person that owns all this acreage. I then get a harvest from that acreage. But the person that owns the ground, they not only get a harvest from it, they get a perpetual harvest because it's a birthright and an inheritance. It's one thing to get a blessing and get a harvest. It's another thing to own the actual land that the harvest is producing a blessing on. We are told in the Psalms, the Father speaking to the Son says, ask of me and I'll give you the nations as your inheritance. The church has been praying for a harvest when we should be asking for inheritance. Matter of fact, Jesus actually tells us, he said, pray the Lord of the harvest to send forth laborers into the harvest field. Because the harvest is the Lord's. The harvest isn't ours. The harvest is actually the Lord's. And a lot of the church has been praying, God, send us a harvest of souls. God, send us the nations, send us a harvest. When actually we have not because we ask, not because we ask amiss. And what we should be asking for is not a harvest. What we should be saying is, God, give us our inheritance. The nations is our inheritance, but only sons get an inheritance. You have to be positioned properly. And you have to know your identity, know who you are, know that you are loved of the Father, you are accepted of the Father, that you are accepted in the Beloved, that his very DNA, divine nature attributes, is flowing through your veins, that you are an heir and you are a joint heir. And this is so much bigger than you getting a quick harvest. Now, let me give you a few examples in Scripture of this. Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve were giving an incredible inheritance. God said, you see, this whole earth, it's all yours. I'm giving you the whole earth, but I'm going to put you in a safe place for a season. I'm going to put you in Eden, a place of voluptuous living, a place that's flowing with rivers, and it's full of fruit, and it's full of vegetables, it's full of life. Everything you need is in this garden, and I'm going to put 2 trees in the garden. I'm going to put the tree of life and the tree of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. Everything in here is yours. That one thing is mine. That's something that you don't touch. That's only mine. Now, the greatest sin that Adam and Eve committed is not that they ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The greatest sin is they never ate of the tree of life. You think when he said, everything in this garden is yours, but that one tree. And the moment he said, over here's a tree of life, you think they would have went and ate of that fruit first. I mean, I would have left the apples and the pears and the peaches and the plums and the watermelon. I would have left all the vegetables. I would have left all that behind, and I would have ran towards that fruit. And I said, man, I want to eat of the tree of life. But they never ate of the tree of life. And when they ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, God had to place angels guarding the way to the tree of life, because they would have eaten of the tree of life after they ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They would have been in that state, perhaps, for eternity. So to protect them, God puts them out of the garden and puts angels guarding the way to the tree so that man could ultimately be redeemed and actually get back to where his original heart and intent was for us in the first place. But Adam and Eve went after a quick harvest. They went after the fruit of that tree when everything in the garden was theirs. They should have said, why do we need that tree, serpent? You see all this? This is all ours. Man, we've got carrots the size of your arms. Man, we've got so much God's blessed us with. Instead, they went after a quick harvest. Jacob and Esau was the same thing. Esau gave up his birthright, or the double portion, for a quick harvest. He wanted the blessing, but not the responsibility of the birthright. As the firstborn son, you had to carry on the family business. You were the one that took care of your mother if something happened to your father. You took responsibility for the family. And there we come back to that stewardship principle again. In order to be a person that is desiring and longing to receive inheritance, responsibility comes along with that. Esau did not want the responsibility. He went after a cup of lentils. He went after some red stew. His whole thing was, give me a quick harvest. I don't want the responsibility. The sad thing is, this is where a lot of people in our world are today. Give me that quick blessing, God. I'm coming to church because, man, I've heard people say for years, how many of you come today to get a blessing? And man, that's frustrated me for years. And I get up a lot of times after I hear that and say, how many of you came to be a blessing today? Rather than just coming to get a blessing all the time, what about being a blessing to somebody else? Why? Because when we have the heart of the king and the kingdom, it's to be a blessing. Joshua and Caleb, the same thing. 2 out of 12 went into the promised land, and 2 of the 10 wanted an inheritance. The 10 just wanted a harvest. Let's go get these grapes. Let's go see this land flowing with milk and honey. But we don't want the inheritance because we're going to have to disinherit someone that's on our inheritance in order to get the inheritance. And they didn't want that, and they gave into it. Elijah and Elisha. Elijah left his inheritance to Elisha, but Elisha gave up the double portion and went to the grave with it. Gehazi went after the money for a harvest, and Elisha had no one to release the inheritance to. See, I've had to learn how to live this also in my life. There's many times I was ready for some things, and God said, wait, it's not time yet. You might be able to get a quick harvest if you do this, but there's an inheritance waiting for you. Now, let me give you a picture of this, and then we'll stop for this session. There's seed time, there's harvest time, but then there's also inheritance. Seed time is a radish seed. That is the 30-fold. Do you know that when you put one radish in the ground, exactly 30 days later, you get one radish back? So whatever you sow, you reap. Harvest is corn. You put one seed of corn in the ground, and 60 days later, it's a picture of 60-fold, that's why it's 60 days later, you get upwards of 700 or more kernels of corn. So you sow a radish, you get a radish back. You do one thing, seed time, you get back what you put in. You sow corn, you get more back. But inheritance is pecans. Do you know that when you sow one pecan in the ground, you have to wait for 7 years? But after that 7th year and the pecan tree has grown, you get a perpetual harvest, which is a picture of 100-fold for 100 years or more, and you get a whole grove of pecan trees. So we have to make up a choice. We have to decide in ourselves, do I just want a quick harvest? Or am I willing to be responsible with my finances? Listen to the voice of the Holy Spirit when He says give, give. Where He says give, give. When He tells me to do it, how He tells me to do it. Because when I listen to His voice and I receive what He has to say, He's got more than just a quick harvest for us. He's got an incredible inheritance that He wants to release in our lives, which is a life-changing thing. I want to encourage you guys. Let the Holy Spirit flow through you with so much abundance, because in blessing, God will bless you. Make up your mind to be a blessing. This thing's so much bigger than rules that we keep. It is seeing an inheritance manifest in our lives. So I want to remind you, regardless of anything you have done or anything you may ever do, God through Christ, grace for all. Tune in to our next program. God bless.
Thank you for watching Grace for All with Jamie Englehart. We have many resources to help you in your journey of grace, including e-courses, audio teaching, and more. If our ministry has blessed you, we ask that you consider a financial gift to help us continue spreading the gospel around the globe. Giving is easy and completely secure at www.graceforall.tv. Thank you for tuning in today, and remember that regardless of what you've done or what you may ever do, God through Christ gives grace for all.